Hi, welcome to the Questions from the Community podcast of the Personality Hacker podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we have a question from Amber that we would like to get to today on this short podcast series. Hi, my name is Amber. I've commented on a few of your posts before. I found Personality Hacker on YouTube, which then led me to your website. I love all the life-changing information you've put on the site. Anyway, I'd love for you guys to make a video or blog post about how past trauma, anxiety disorders, etc. can play a role in type confusion. For example, I test out as an INFP, but sometimes an INFJ. As I dig deeper into myself, trying to uncover my true functions, I found they are covered by, quote, defense mechanisms, unquote, that have developed because of fears or hurts. I've mistaken some of these fears and hurts as authentic to myself, but maybe they aren't who I am at all. One example would be the spontaneous aspect of INFPs. I found that when I feel safe, my fears and hurts aren't weighing me down. I can be quite spontaneous. I believe this plays a role in how I answer questions when type testing because I don't know if I'm truly a planner or if I'm planning because fears I've developed over past negative situations. Basically fears that she's developed over past negative situations. On the one hand, I dislike being tied down, and it's hard for me to make decisions if I'm not passionate about something because I can see everything both ways. This back and forth of planner versus free spirit causes mixed test results depending on the type of questions asked. I would love to read or hear your take on this and how walls, defense mechanisms, survival skills that I've collected over the years make it hard to identify how I'm functioning. Maybe this is one of the many reasons INFPs and INFJs and other types can't pinpoint exactly which type they are. How would you recommend getting past layers and truly identifying our functions? Identifying things as protective layers and not as personality quirks would go a long way in helping people grow and heal. And this comes from Amber.
That's an excellent question. The idea of what is part of my wiring versus what is a strategy for dealing with the world.
And how does it affect what I test out as basically as a personality?
Right, because this is the limitation. This is really the limitation of all written tests. That written tests are fundamentally all assessments and tests. They're trying to get to the hardwiring of your brain. But you don't know the hardwiring of your brain. That's why you're taking a test, right? Like if you knew that, you wouldn't have to go take the test in the first place. So the test and assessments can't ask you really nuanced questions about how your brain is wired. They have to ask what I call side door questions to try to suss out how your wiring is showing up in your behavior or your preferences. And that makes all assessments and even like live profiling sessions as a person who does a crap ton of live, profiling where I'm asking the questions and they're not forced choice. They're not A or B. They're open-ended. They allow the person to, talk as much as they want in any specific subject that's interesting to them. And I'm trying to get to the wiring of their brain through all these side door questions about the behavior. Even then it becomes really difficult because there's a lot of different reasons why we do what we do. And trauma is one of them. People can be behaving in certain ways, not based on preference, not based on wiring, but based on trauma and suggested behavior from people who are highly influential in their lives that suggested it maybe with a belt.
Well,
right?
It always doesn't have to be just trauma-based. It could just be training. Like just repetitive training through your life. This is how you exhibit yourself in the world. And so you've trained yourself that way. So you answer questions accordingly. It doesn't have to be tied to trauma directly.
Absolutely. It can be training. It can be muscle memory. It can be, it was my way or the highway in the house. And so, I'm a perceiver, but my parents were, a place for everything and everything in its place. And now I have to make sure that everything goes in its place. So yeah, there's a lot that comes into these questions. I think there's a couple different ways you can look at this. If you just stay within the Myers-Briggs framework, which I actually don't recommend you do. I recommend looking at lots of different maps and models for understanding humans. And in particular, when we're talking about strategies for going through the world, I highly recommend looking at the Enneagram. The Enneagram is it's a 9-pointed system of typology that talks a lot about our unconscious fears, our unconscious obsessions, the things that the gifts we bring to the world, as well as how that those gifts can show up in a bad way, our strategies for navigating the world, some of our core emotions that come up over and over, are basically our strategy and emotional imagos. And so I highly recommend looking at the Enneagram. We did a couple podcasts on the Enneagram, or at least one, when we interviewed our friend Kelly, who's an Enneagram expert. I highly recommend going and listening to that. But if you're not going to look at other systems, then if you just look within the Myers-Briggs system, one of the patterns I've seen over and over is that when we are showing up not at our best self, if we have damage or trauma that we have to heal from, we generally tend to go to an extremely defensive position. And when I say defensive, I don't just mean that we are, we're being defensive in arguments. That's not what I mean when I say defensive. Not just like somebody said something we disagree with and we disagreed with them and they're attacking what we said and now we have to defend what we just said. I'm not talking about that kind of defensiveness. I'm talking about the defensiveness that shows up whenever the universe is trying to give you a message and you're just not ready to hear it yet. Like, that's not a piece of information you want. And the piece of information could be, you're an amazing human being. And the universe keeps trying to tell you that over and over. And for some reason, that wiring, like the synapses that connect that go, oh, I'm an amazing person, they're just not like those, they're being taken up by other messages like you're a shitty person and you don't deserve to live. And those are the neural pathways that have gotten a lot of ground and are really deeply entrenched and have little laser fat over them to protect them.
Sure.
So when the universe says, hey, you're an amazing person, our brains are just not ready to rewire that quickly. And that's what I mean by defensive. It could be that you're defending a position all the way to the universe is trying to give you a message and you just cannot hear it yet. And I've noticed that one of the things that we do cognitively that could be seen through the lens of the Myers-Briggs system is that if you look at the CAR model, which is our metaphor for your four cognitive function stack in the Myers-Briggs system. And if you're not familiar with this, if this is maybe one of your first podcasts, I recommend going to the blog, the Personality Hacker blog, and just put in the search and search field CAR model, and lots of different articles will come up, and you'll get lost and go read about all those the CAR model metaphors. But basically, the CAR model are the four functions, the four mental processes that influence you as a person the most. This is your fundamental wiring. And in the CAR model, we have a driver, a co-pilot. Behind the co-pilot is a 10-year-old, and behind the driver is a 3-year-old. And I've noticed that when we're real defensive, we have a tendency to run to our 10-year-old process, that 10-year-old mental process. Now, obviously, the 10-year-old mental process is going to be different depending upon our personality type. And it's going to make us show up a little differently than fully embracing our driver and co-pilot, which is really when we're in our genius. We're in our genius flow when we're fully in our driver and co-pilot. If we miss the co-pilot and go to the 10-year-old, which is generally how this entire dynamic works out, is we're still in the driver process. That doesn't go away. But instead of consulting our adult, co-pilot navigator position to help round us out as people, we skip the navigator co-pilot and we go to the 10-year-old to say, hey, what do you think is going on? Now, what's interesting about the 10-year-old position is that it's going to show up as a slightly different type. It will actually encourage us to show up as a different type because it will be us not in our strengths. So if you take my type, for example, I'm an ENTP. I'm a perceiver. That means I love freedom. That means all sorts of behaviors that come from perceiver types. But my 10-year-old process is called extroverted feeling. Now, extroverted feeling, or what we call harmony, is the preferred function for judgers, right? For EFJs and IFJs. If I go too much into that 10-year-old position, even though I'm an ENTP, very, very, very perceivery, I'm going to show up like a judger. In fact, not just a judger, but this is me being defensive. This is me being not in a good space. I'm going to show up like a judgmental judger. Not just a judger who like wants things to be in a certain way, but I'm going to show up like socially judgmental. And I'm going to believe I know what everybody else should be doing. And I'm going to be upset with them if they don't. And I'm probably going to like be emotionally manipulative or maybe even emotionally indulgent, right? Dramatic until I get it. That's me not at my best. How does yours show up, or were you going to go that direction?
Oh, no, I was just going to say, so basically what you're saying then also is if you are in the habit of living in this space where you're going to this 10-year-old process a lot, and then you sit down to take a personality test, well, you're going to answer much differently than if you're living in your strengths because it's skewing how you'll answer. So even though it may not be tied to trauma for you, if you're living there, if you spent time there developing that and being in that 10-year-old process, a question might come up and you might answer with your 10-year-old hat on, in a sense. Like if you visually have a metaphor or an image of a 10-year-old in your car, the 10-year-old is going to be answering that question for you, and it might skew some of your personality results. It might be a reason why you'd get a different type on a written test, for example, or even in our live profiling session than if you were answering from your strength positions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And in fact, I believe that when I first took the Myers-Briggs test a million years ago, I think I did test out as an ENTJ, interestingly enough. Now, I would have been a teenager, and it's a little more difficult to definitively know the type of a teenager. But that said, yeah, you can show up as a different type on tests if you are too used to going to that space.
And for example, my 10-year-old process is a thinking process. The technical term is extroverted thinking. We've nicknamed it effectiveness. And I too, when I tested out a long time ago, I tested out as a thinker, even though I'm clearly a feeler. That's my strength, is to be my feeling process in my car model. I tested out as a thinker because I over-identify with that 10-year-old process in a less developed part of myself. So I also skewed my results because I wasn't answering from the most authentic place for me.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, that wasn't from trauma necessarily. Although I would say that neither of us were in our best spaces when we did that. So even if it's not necessarily trauma, like you were mentioning before, it can just be that we are not showing up to the world as the best versions of ourselves. And so because of that, we end up over-relying on tools and behavior patterns that, don't actually fully represent our natural wiring, our preferences. And the same thing, one of the worst times that you can take a personality test is when you're depressed. It's like a terrible time to take a personality test. And even more so then, you might show up as a completely different personality type because when we're depressed, we're usually in our 3-year-old process. Our 3-year-old process is going to massively skew our results because the 3-year-old is not, we so don't identify with the 3-year-old when we're feeling good and healthy that if somebody gives you a real good, strong description of that 3-year-old process, almost everybody either checks out, gets bored, or gets icked out and goes, ew. Right? Like, ew. It's a part of who we are, and it's not a part that we want to reject. And at the same time, it is not our best selves. It's not how we identify with ourselves. If we stay there too much, we're not going to feel good about it. So taking a personality test when you're depressed is a terrible idea, and it absolutely will skew your results. And taking a personality test when you're not feeling great about yourself, when you're just not feeling at your best self, is also probably going to skew the results because you're probably going to end up over-representing that 10-year-old process.
So Amber's question gets down to a little bit of specific type. So let's address, just briefly, her specific question about, she types out either INFJ or INFP, for example. And we actually, you, Antonia, just wrote an article recently about this because it's been such a question from so many INFPs and INFJs that there's a lot of confusion around which they might be. And so you've written an entire article on our website, personalityhacker.com. If you want to go search that, I think it's called INFJ versus INFP. And it has some indication, or INFP versus INFJ, one of those configurations. It has some great strategies and ideas on how that can look if you're typing out, both of those two types. So that's in a specific term around those two types. But in a general sense, when you're showing up to take an online written test or do a profile live, what are some things we can help people with when they're typing out this type on one test, this type on another test, and it's like, which type am I? What are some just general senses of how to show up to a test, how to show up when you're doing this? Because if you know what you're doing, you could also game a test. You could also skew the results based on answering what you think they want to hear rather than what's true to you.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, getting the correct type on a Myers-Briggs assessment isn't going to be a game changer unless for you the information is very powerful and is game changing for you subjectively. But if you game the system, that's fine. You're allowed to do that. It's not that big of a deal. When you get the right when you get the right type, though, there's a lot of insight in there. And so I do recommend that you show up at your best self if possible. So if you're going through a rough time period, maybe this is not the time to take an online assessment. If you don't feel like you've been yourself, if you feel depressed, if you feel down, I would wait until you are in a positive frame of mind, a positive where you feel good about yourself frame of mind. I also would look out for things like, in fact, we've written a couple articles on the site about like, what if you're just having perpetual confusion around your type? There are some resources that help, like get familiar with the cognitive functions, because there's really 2 layers to this Myers-Briggs thing. There's the dichotomy layer, which is, are you introvert, extrovert, sensing, intuitive, thinking, feeling, judging, perceiving? That's the tip of the iceberg. That's where most people stay. And that's the information that is the most simple to handle. So if you want to just stay there, there's lots of cool resources. On our site, we have some very interesting takes on what the actual difference between, say, a judger and perceiver is. What's interesting in Amber's question is she had a lot of concepts around loving freedom and being spontaneous versus wanting to plan. Our belief is that those are emergent behaviors, that the difference between judgers and perceivers actually is not whether or not you're spontaneous or like to plan. I know perceivers that enjoy planning, and I know judgers that are highly spontaneous. It's really more about which world is your organized world versus which world is your, you want freedom in. And I'll let you look up that particular post on Personality Hacker. What's the actual difference between judger and perceiver? So get some really behind the scenes ideas on what the real difference between these 2 dichotomies are. Like, don't just take the surface stuff like, oh, I love to travel and be improvisational. I must be a perceiver. That's not how it works. So get some really good content there. And then if you're still experiencing confusion, go 1 step layer, deeper and get into the cognitive functions. Those are the mental processes. This is the wiring of your brain that is the starting point, the platform, or the launching pad for all your behaviors. So really get deep into cognitive functions and really understand how those work. And ask yourself, what do you believe your wiring is? And then get, more information around the configuration of the cognitive functions within each type. Like an INFJ and an INFP, they show up very similar to the world. Their wiring is totally different. And so, and even more confusing is an INFJ technically leads with what's called a perceiving function, and an INFP technically leads with what's called a judging function, throwing even more confusion in the mix. So get familiar with some of these concepts. What does that mean? What does it mean to be an INFP? What does it mean to, what's your cognitive function stack as an INFP versus an INFJ? And how is that going to influence how you show up in the world? Really go deeper. And if you're just too lazy for all that, you can always hire somebody. And there are different companies that have profiling services. I know multiple different companies that'll do that. We do that. If you want to, contact us and get an evaluation, we call it profiler verification session, and you can contact us and we'll do a verification session on you and figure out some of these things too. So there are a lot of different resources. Don't give up if you've got an instinct that tells you that this is some pretty powerful stuff for you. I recommend keeping going. Like, keep going down the rabbit hole, figure it out, because you're probably right. Your instinct is good. There is some really deep, high quality information at the end of the road.
Yeah, and what I love about this too is this is, finding out your personality type from Personality Hacker standpoint. We have the name Personality Hacker, and so you might think that that's what we're all about. But what we see personality as is the starting point, the launching pad, the lens to see your entire personal development journey through. It's just kind of your you are here dot in the planet. Like, who am I? Where am I starting from? Because this is the beginning. This is where we're going to start from. And we want to be with you for the entire journey. And so it's really exciting if you are wrestling with this and you're reading some resources, you're getting some deep, insight into this. That means you're really digging out some of the nuggets of your personality. And you might decide to get, one of the starter kits on the website, some of the premium content around your personality. Once you really figure out what that is, it's a great launching pad for you. So again, I'm excited that if you're listening and you're going to dig into your personality, this is a really great place to start for your personal development journey. It's going to inform how you go about growing as a person, what resources you access, what courses you end up taking, what kind of career you're going to go toward, what relationships are great for you. It's really that starting piece.
Yeah. And going back to the original question, which is how does our trauma influence us? Myers-Briggs might not be the best place to look for trauma strategies. I would, again, highly recommend looking at the Enneagram. The Enneagram is a great model for understanding some of the strategies we pick up. And actually, arguably, those strategies are, again, part of our DNA. Like, no matter whether or not we were going to experience trauma, these may have been like locked in, imprinted strategies that were waiting to blossom at the moment that we received trauma that said, okay, so let's kick into this strategy to be able to deal with the world that's going to throw trauma at us or these situations. Understanding how you deal with trauma is a major piece of the Enneagram. And then what's great about the Enneagram too is that it is intended to use awareness of these strategies, awareness of how your brain is programmed to deal with trauma, to be able to lift you out of that and to become healthier versions of yourself and what that looks like and guide your journey through that. We're absolutely mesmerized by the Enneagram. We do a lot of Myers-Briggs because that seems to be what we attract people to, but we also love the Enneagram. So look up, we have Enneagram articles on the website. We have an Enneagram podcast. We'll probably be talking about the Enneagram more and more. Probably this year, we'll be launching more and more into that. So keep your ears, open for that. And I do recommend going down that rabbit's hole as well, specifically if you're having trouble typing yourself based on what you believe is trauma.
Absolutely. We want to hear from you. Again, this is our Questions from the Community short form podcast that we release ancillary to our main podcast each week. And you can find us over at the personalityhacker.com website. Personality Hacker has lots of articles. You can obviously do the assessment. We have a test there that you can test your personality, read a lot of resources there. Also at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack, HACK. We can interact with you there as well. That's all part of the big community at large. So we're glad you're listening. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk to you on the next Questions from the Community podcast.